In the dim glow before dawn, as the Pacific swelled like a breathing giant beneath their hulls, Japanese officers once believed they understood every shadow, every signal, every whisper of American movement, until night they learned the truth about U.S. radar, a truth so sudden and devastating that it carved fear straight into the marrow of their empire, turning certainty into panic, and silence into the sound of a nation realizing it had never been watching the enemy had been watching them. War in its coldest form is not fought with bullets or bravery, but with the invisible. The signals drifting through the sky, the humming of unseen machines, the knowledge that one side holds a key the other cannot break. And in World War II, as ships crawled across the vast Pacific and planes carved black scars into the night, Japan learned that the war's deadliest weapon was something they could not touch, could not see, and could not silence. It was the American ability to pierce the darkness itself. It began on a night when the ocean seemed too calm, as if hiding its intentions beneath a polished sheet of moonlit steel. While deep inside a Japanese task force steaming toward the Central Pacific, officers scanned the horizon with binoculars raised like shields against the unknown, unaware that far beyond their visible world, American radar operators were already tracking every mile of their advance with eerie precision, their glowing screens pulsing like living oracles inside dim, silent rooms on distant islands and carriers. And as the Japanese ships pressed forward, confident in their doctrine of surprise, a strange unease settled among the senior commanders, an unspoken tension born from recent battles in which American aircraft had appeared not like scouts that stumbled upon opportunity, but like predators that already knew where the prey would run, striking from angles too perfect to be chance, arriving at moments too exact to be coincidence, a pattern that whispered of something unnatural. And in Tokyo, analysts began stitching fragments of interceptor reports into a disturbing tapestry. U.S. planes diving out of clouds precisely where Japanese formations hid, American submarines positioning themselves in paths no chart could have predicted, and raids that found convoys in the middle of storms where visibility collapsed into nothing, all of it pointing toward a single, terrifying possibility, that the Americans were not relying on luck, nor reconnaissance, nor instinct, but on an invisible sense that mapped the world in waves, a sense that rendered Japanese night attacks useless, nullified their belief in surprise, and threatened their entire naval strategy. And so, when a battered destroyer limped back to Truk Lagoon carrying officers who swore American fighters intercepted them before dawn despite no scouts being sighted, whispers spread through the base like cold wind in abandoned corridors. Whispers that the Americans could see in the dark, could see through storms, could see beyond the horizon itself, a revelation that unsettled even the most stoic admirals, because if the enemy truly possessed such an eye that never blinked, then Japan was no longer the hunter of the Pacific, but the hunted. In the weeks that followed, the truth gathered weight like a storm swelling beneath the horizon, until it could no longer be ignored, and within dim strategy rooms in Tokyo where maps stretched across entire walls and lamplit smoke hung motionless in the stale air, senior officers examined report after report describing American air raids that aligned too precisely with Japanese movements, making it impossible to dismiss the pattern as coincidence. And as those reports grew thicker, so did the realization that their empire's most carefully guarded operations were unraveling in the hands of an enemy that seemed to possess a ghost-like foresight. It became evident in the painful silence of debriefings, where surviving pilots, shaken and ash-covered, spoke of American fighters appearing out of cloud banks as though summoned by some invisible beacon, and in the hollow eyes of submarine captains who returned with tales of U.S. destroyers locking onto them from miles away, reacting to their presence with impossible speed, forcing them to dive deeper and faster than any doctrine prepared them for, and aboard the giant Japanese battleships, the pride of the Navy built on steel and honor, crews felt that pride crack as entire formations were ambushed despite perfect radio silence, leaving officers to wonder how an enemy could strike without ever seeing them in the traditional sense, a thought that seeded dread, because to lose the power of invisibility in the Pacific night was to lose the very foundation of Japan's naval strategy. Meanwhile, on American carriers far across the ocean, radar screens glowed with ghostly green arcs, tracing Japanese fleets with a confidence that startled even young operators who had never known war without this technology, their fingertips gliding over dials as if connected to some omniscient force whispering coordinates into their minds. And each time those radar operators called out bearing and distance with uncanny accuracy, each time pilots launched before the enemy even knew danger approached, the balance of Pacific shifted more sharply, because Japan had built its war machine around surprise, night attacks, and the belief that visibility controlled the battlefield. But now visibility belonged to America, and Japan, realizing this bitter truth, fell into a quiet, spreading panic, knowing that for every plan they made, for every fleet they moved, for every convoy they hid in the drifting fog, the Americans already saw them as glowing silhouettes on a screen, as faint echoes bouncing across the sky, as prey marked long before the trap was sprung. The breaking point arrived not with roar, but with a whisper, a soft, almost embarrassed admission tucked inside a classified memo that moved through the Imperial Navy like a tremor, stating that American radar had been detected on aircraft long before the planes themselves appeared, a confession that stripped away the last shreds of denial and forced Japan to confront the scale of their disadvantage. For the enemy carried this invisible shield into every battle. Then Japan's once legendary night attacks, their cherished doctrine of striking from the shadows, had become nothing more than rituals performed for an enemy that always saw them coming. And in the cold corridors of naval intelligence, mid-ranking officers began to understand what this meant not just tactically, but philosophically, because war in Japanese tradition was fought through spirit, discipline, and mastery of the seen world. Yet America had removed the scene from the equation itself, replacing it with waveforms and echoes, ghost signals that turned the ocean into a lattice of intersecting lines, mapping every vessel that dared to move beneath them. It was during these tense months that the Emperor's strategists realized even their coded transmissions, their decoys, their carefully timed convoys all faltered before the Americans' growing network of long-range radar, which painted their fleet movements with unsettling accuracy. And this realization spread to the ranks like an airborne fear. The fear that no matter how disciplined their pilots were, no matter how silent their submarines ran, no matter how carefully their battleships maneuvered through the vast Pacific theater, the Americans possessed a vision that pierced the very soul of their war, and this vision made every Japanese sailor feel disturbingly exposed. And on the front lines, where men wrestled with exhaustion more than ideology, pilots described the crushing emotional burden of diving into battle knowing the enemy had already predicted their arrival, their altitude, their direction, their very heartbeat, while submarine crews spoke of hearing depth charges fall with precision too accurate to be normal, as if the Americans were reading the water itself. And so, in the dark hours between battles, in the moments when waves slapped gently against steel hulls and fear grew most honest, Japanese officers pondered truth that felt heavier than defeat itself. They had not simply been outmaneuvered or outgunned. They had been outseen, outwatched, outunderstood, and in that invisible battlefield of signals and silence, Japan realized they were losing a war not of ships or airplanes, but perception itself, a war where the enemy could sense their presence long before they could prove their existence. In the final year of the Pacific War, as Japan's empire crumbled like old stone beneath the relentless pressure of an enemy that seemed to read the sea, the sky, and even the quiet spaces between breaths, the truth about American radar settled over the nation, not as a single moment of revelation, but as a slow, spreading grief, the kind that seeps into the marrow and forces a society to confront how fragile certainty truly is, for they had entered the conflict believing valor and discipline could overcome any machine, any nation, any obstacle. But in the end, it was an invisible wave, a pulse of energy humming through distant skies, that unraveled their strategies and stripped their fleets bare. Yet within that bitter understanding came a deeper, almost human clarity, one whispered among returning sailors who survived the storms of iron and flame. That war is not decided by the strongest arm or the sharpest sword, but by the quiet minds who reshape the world without ever firing a shot, minds who build devices that do not kill but reveal, and in revealing, change everything. And as Japan capitulated, as fires dimmed and islands grew silent, as radar towers flickered across the once bloodied horizon like sentinels watching over oceans that no longer belonged to war, a haunting realization emerged that humanity's greatest power, the ability to see beyond darkness, always comes at cost. For once you pierce the night so completely, once you learn to unveil what others desperately try to hide, you inherit the burden of understanding just how blind we all were before, and how easily blindness can return if we forget what this war carved into the world. That knowledge can destroy as easily as it can save. That foresight can breed mercy or devastation. And that the true cost of war is not measured in wreckage or victories, but in the silent, lingering truth that every nation carries afterward. That in our desperate attempts to outsee one another, we often forget to look inward where the deepest shadows still remain.